Bennett.
I did not expect to see you. He understood all the family were from home, or we should never have presumed.
I returned a day early.
He has an Oscar on his shelf, a knighthood-adjacent honor from the Queen, and a face that an entire generation associates with the word romantic. And yet, if you sat Colin Firth down today, at 65, and asked him to describe his life in one word, there's a real chance he would not choose anything close to charmed. Behind the awards and the swoon-worthy roles is a man who spent his childhood never quite knowing which country he belonged to, who became a father before he was ready for what came after, who watched a 22-year marriage dissolve in the middle of a stalking case involving his own wife's lover, and who has spent the last several years quietly turning his private grief into some of the most devastating performances of his career. This is the real story of Colin Firth, not the poster, not the wet shirt, but the man underneath it. Long before anyone knew his name, Colin Firth was a child who never got to settle. He was born on the 10th of September, 1960, in the small Hampshire village of Grayshot, into a family built almost entirely out of scholars and clergy. His father lectured in history and had worked as an education officer in Nigeria. His mother taught comparative religion at university level. On both sides of the family tree sat missionaries and ministers, so faith and academic ambition were baked into the household before Colin ever had a say in the matter. What that also meant was near constant movement. The family relocated to Nigeria shortly after he was born, while his father took up a post at the University of Ibadan, and by the time Colin was 4 they were back in England. But the uprooting did not stop there. In 1971, at 11 years old, he was pulled out of everything familiar and dropped into St. Louis, Missouri, where his father had taken a visiting teaching position. For a shy English boy with an accent that stuck out like a siren, that year became a masterclass in humiliation. He was teased relentlessly, and like a lot of children who are mocked for being different, he learned to disappear inside a performance. He flattened his vowels into something more Midwestern, and he pretended not to care about anything, including his schoolwork. It worked, in the narrow sense that it stopped the teasing. But what it actually taught him was how to build a version of himself for public consumption, a skill that would later make him one of the most controlled actors of his generation, and one that, privately, may have cost him something too. Returning to England did not fix things either. Secondary school in Winchester brought more of the same isolation and bullying, more of that low hum of not belonging anywhere in particular. Then, in his early teens, something shifted. He discovered acting, partly inspired by watching Paul Scofield's towering performance in A Man for All Seasons, and for the first time he had found a place where feeling like an outsider was actually an advantage. By 14 he had made up his mind that this was not a passing interest, it was the only thing that made sense to him. He started attending drama workshops from the age of 10, and by his sixth form years at Barton Peveril College, a teacher named Penny Edwards opened up English literature to him in a way he has described as genuinely transformative. He has said, more than once, that those 2 years remain among the happiest of his entire life. After sixth form, he moved to London, joined the National Youth Theatre, worked in the wardrobe department at the National Theatre to pay the bills, and eventually earned a place at Drama Centre London, a demanding, Stanislavski-based training ground that also produced actors like Pierce Brosnan and Helen McCrory. He worked 6 days a week there, immersed in a training method that pushed students to draw performance directly out of lived emotional truth rather than technique alone, an approach that would show up again and again in his later work, in the way he could make silence carry as much weight as dialogue. Playing Hamlet in the school's end-of-year production caught the attention of playwright Julia Mitchell, who then cast him in the West End production of Another Country, stepping into a role that Daniel Day-Lewis had originated. That play had already launched one major career. It was about to launch a second. The 1984 film version of Another Country gave Firth his screen debut, opposite Rupert Everett, and for years afterward, entertainment writers loved to dwell on the tension between the two men during that production. Everett later admitted, in his own memoir, that the friction had far more to do with professional jealousy than any real dislike between them, and Firth himself has since said the two eventually made peace, and that he now counts Everett among the people in this industry he genuinely admires. What is worth noticing, though, is that the pattern was already visible at the very start of his career: complicated relationships, quiet tension, things that took years to resolve rather than dissolving cleanly. If you want the single moment that changed the entire trajectory of Colin Firth's life, it happened in the autumn of 1995. The BBC's adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice premiered on the 24th of September that year, and by the time the final episode aired, the culture around him had permanently shifted. Playing Mr. Darcy did not just make him a respected working actor with a strong reputation. It turned him into a household name across continents, in a way that had almost nothing to do with the usual rules of critical acclaim. The scene of Darcy emerging from a lake in a soaked white shirt became, almost instantly, one of the most talked about moments in British television history, watched by more than 10 million people and dissected in newspapers well beyond the UK. What made the performance land the way it did wasn't showy charisma. It was restraint. Firth understood that Darcy's magnetism lives entirely in what the character refuses to show, the tightly held feeling, the reluctant, slow surrender of pride to something more honest underneath it. The novelist Helen Fielding was so struck by the cultural moment that she built an entire character, Mark Darcy, around the persona Firth had created, folding his real-life image directly into the Bridget Jones books. He would go on to play that character across 4 films spanning 24 years, ending with Bridget Jones, Mad About the Boy in 2025. The role he had almost turned down became the role that, in some sense, he never fully got to leave behind. The years right after Pride and Prejudice were strange ones for him, in truth. He has admitted in interviews that the sudden scale of that fame unsettled him more than it flattered him, that being reduced, almost overnight, to a single wet shirt image felt like a kind of trap as much as a triumph. He took supporting and character roles through the rest of the 90s partly to prove to himself and to casting directors that there was more range in him than one soaked white shirt could suggest, even as offers for more conventional romantic leads kept arriving. That tension between the performer he wanted to be recognized as and the heartthrob the public wanted to keep watching would follow him for years, resurfacing again decades later, when he agreed to play the impeccably tailored spy Harry Hart in the Kingsman franchise, a role that let him send up his own reputation for buttoned-up English restraint, while still delivering it completely straight-faced. While his career was catching fire, his personal life was already tangled. A relationship with actress Meg Tilly, his co-star in the 1989 film Valmorn, had produced a son, William Joseph Firth, born in September 1990. The family settled in British Columbia, but the relationship ended in 1994, meaning Firth became a father at 30 and a separated father not long after, something he has almost never discussed publicly in any real depth, but which clearly shaped the emotional undercurrent of the following decade. Then, during the filming of Pride and Prejudice itself, a relationship developed between Firth and his co-star Jennifer Ely, one that only drew tabloid attention after the two had already separated. By 1997, he had met Livia Gigioli, an Italian film producer, on the set of the BBC drama Nostromo, and the two married that same year. For a while, it looked like the stability he had never had as a child. 2 sons followed, Luca, born in 2001, and Matteo, born in 2003, arriving during a stretch when his career was also expanding in every direction. A BAFTA nomination for Bridget Jones's Diary in 2001, Girl with a Pearl Earring in 2003, and a central place in the sprawling ensemble of Love Actually that same year. The decade moved fast, and one success simply led on to the next. Then came a role that reshaped how the industry saw him entirely. Tom Ford's A Single Man, released in 2009, cast Firth as a gay British professor in 1960s Los Angeles who, in the wake of losing his long-term partner, spends a single day quietly deciding whether he wants to keep living. The control the part demanded was extraordinary. Every ounce of grief had to live inside stillness, inside the body, without ever being spoken outright. He won the BAFTA for Best Actor, earned his first Academy Award nomination, and took the Volpe Cup at the Venice Film Festival. Critics reached for words like masterful and quietly devastating, and the performance proved something his earlier, lighter work had only hinted at, that Colin Firth could carry an entire film's emotional weight without a single dramatic outburst. What followed that momentum was the King's Speech. The King's Speech arrived in 2010 and did something very few films managed to pull off cleanly. It put exactly the right actor inside exactly the right story at exactly the right cultural moment. Firth played the future King George VI, a man wrestling with a severe stammer as Britain edged toward the Second World War, working opposite Geoffrey Rush as speech therapist Lionel Logue. The film made well over $400 million worldwide against a modest production budget, becoming one of the most commercially successful independent British films ever made. At the 83rd Academy Awards, it picked up 12 nominations and won 4, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Firth, on top of the Golden Globe, the BAFTA, and the Screen Actors Guild Award. Standing at the podium that night in February 2011, he joked, with typical dry understatement, that he suspected his career had just peaked. The audience laughed. He was not entirely wrong. Within the same year he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, appeared on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people in the world, and was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II for his services to drama. In 2016, he also took Italian citizenship through Livia, a decision he was open about connecting to the Brexit referendum and his desire to hold on to a European identity. On paper, everything about his life looked settled, even enviable. He kept working steadily through those same years too, popping up in the Mamma Mia films as the button-down Harry Bright, a part that let a wider, more casual audience see a looser, more comic side of him than the one built by Darcy and George. 6. It is easy to forget, looking back at the string of prestige dramas, just how much lighter, broader work he also said yes to during this stretch, as if he needed the levity of a jukebox musical to balance out the heaviness of everything happening at home. Underneath that surface, though, the marriage was already coming apart. Between 2015 and 2016, Colin and Livia went through a private separation that they kept almost entirely out of public view. During that period, Livia became involved with an Italian journalist named Marco Brancaccia, a childhood friend, and the marriage entered a phase it would never fully recover from. The couple did reconcile afterward, and Firth issued a public statement in 2018 once the story had already broken in the press. What made the situation especially painful was the legal side of it. Livia filed a stalking complaint against Brancaccia after the relationship with him ended. Italian authorities formally charged him, and the case was resolved through an undisclosed settlement in July 2018, with Brancaccia publicly disputing the account. For a man whose public image had always rested on restraint and quiet dignity, having those details splashed across international headlines was its own particular kind of exposure. The reconciliation, in the end, did not hold. In 2019, after more than 2 decades of marriage, Colin and Livia announced they were formally separating, describing themselves as remaining close friends who shared a commitment to their children and asking simply to be left alone. The divorce was finalized in 2021. By November 2025, Livia confirmed in a social media post, while mourning the death of her partner's dog, that she had quietly married a Scottish environmental campaigner named Callum Grieve. Colin Firth, by then 64, was doing what most people do after something like that ends, starting over in the ordinary, unglamorous way, without ceremony, and without the language to fully describe what it actually feels like. You can see the weight of those years in the roles he chose next. He gravitated, again and again, toward characters carrying grief that never fully resolves. In 2020's Supernova, he starred opposite Stanley Tucci as a man slowly losing his partner to dementia, a project that carried an unusually personal directness. In 2022's The Staircase, an HBO limited series, he played novelist Michael Peterson, a man accused of murdering his wife, forcing him into a kind of moral ambiguity that ran completely against the composed image the public had built around him for decades. The performance earned him Emmy nominations for both Conspiracy and The Staircase, recognition for work that a lot of audiences, still holding on to the romantic leading man from years earlier, simply had not caught up to yet. Then, in 2025, he took on one of the most demanding roles of his entire career. In Lockerbie, A Search for Truth, a 5-part Sky Atlantic and Peacock series based on Jim Swire's own memoir, Firth played Swire himself, a real British physician whose 23-year-old daughter, Flora, was killed aboard Pan Am Flight 103 when it was destroyed by a bomb over the Scottish town of Lockerbie in December 1988. The series follows Swire's decades-long, obsessive campaign for the truth behind the bombing, a journey that pulled him away from his own surviving family even as it consumed him. Firth met with the real Jim Swire while preparing for the role, and Swire himself later spoke warmly about Firth's involvement, calling him a steady, generous presence throughout filming. Critics singled out the performance as some of the most powerful work of Firth's later career, precisely because of how much restraint it demanded, grief that had to sit in a man's posture and silences rather than in big speeches. There is something quietly striking about an actor in his 60s choosing to spend a year inside the story of a father whose life was permanently reorganized by loss, at almost exactly the stage of life where Firth himself was still working through the end of his own long marriage. That same year, he also closed out the Bridget Jones story for good, reprising Mark Darcy one final time in Bridget Jones, Mad About the Boy, 24 years after the character first walked onto screens. What had started, in the late 90s, as a wry cultural joke about his own Mr. Darcy fame had, by 2025, turned into something far more sincere. Mark Darcy had visibly aged. He carried history. He had loved and been loved imperfectly, and the audience who had grown up alongside the character brought all of that accumulated feeling into the cinema with them. Renee Zellweger returned opposite him as Bridget, and the chemistry between the two of them had the texture of something genuinely lived in rather than simply performed for a camera. The film was received warmly, and part of that warmth clearly belonged to the man behind the role, a quiet, collective sense that something which had mattered for a long time was finally, gently, being put down. Only months later, in June 2026, Firth appeared in something entirely different. Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day, a big-budget science fiction thriller alongside Emily Blunt, Josh O'Connor, and Colman Domingo. In it, Firth plays firmly against type, taking on the role of the film's antagonist, the head of a shadowy organization built to conceal the truth about extraterrestrial contact from the public. It was a deliberate, almost startling departure for an actor so associated with warmth and decency, and it showed, once again, that even at 65, he is still actively choosing to be uncomfortable rather than coasting on the goodwill built up over 40 years of career. His net worth today is estimated at around $25 million, the product of decades spent across film, television, and behind-the-scenes production work. He founded his own production company, Rain Dog Films, back in 2012, and has used it to back projects like Eye in the Sky and Loving, films chosen less for obvious commercial appeal and more for a kind of moral seriousness that seems to matter to him personally. It is a quieter, less visible layer of his career than the acting, mostly conducted away from red carpets, but it points to the same instincts you can trace through his choice of roles, an attraction to stories about people forced to reckon with consequences, with the cost of doing the right thing, with the slow grind of conscience rather than the quick payoff of spectacle. That instinct, choosing which stories are worth putting resources behind, tells you something about his priorities that the acting alone doesn't fully explain. He keeps reaching for material that costs him something, that asks something difficult of the people watching it, that refuses an easy, tidy resolution. But the money was never really the story here. The story is what the decades cost alongside what they built. 3 children across 2 different relationships. A marriage that lasted 22 years and ultimately ended through a mixture of distance, a very public affair turned stalking case, and the particular kind of exhaustion that builds inside a long partnership when 2 people have quietly started pulling in different directions. A career that hit its absolute peak at almost the exact moment his private life had begun its slow, invisible unraveling. Both things were happening at once, the Oscar and the collapse, sitting side by side in the very same years, and from the outside, the world mostly only ever got to see one of them clearly. What the story of Colin Firth actually looks like, when you step back from the highlight reel, is this: a talented, thoughtful man who spent decades achieving enormous professional success while privately navigating displacement, separation, public scandal, and loss, without ever quite managing to hold both halves of his life steady in the same hand at the same time. The awards came. The iconic roles came. And running underneath all of it was a private story about a boy who never quite felt like he belonged anywhere, who eventually built a home, watched it slowly come apart, and then began the quiet, unglamorous work of continuing anyway. That is not really a tragedy in the dramatic, theatrical sense, because a tragedy in that sense demands a final collapse, an ending. What Colin Firth actually represents is something more complicated and, honestly, more human than that. A life holding real greatness and real heartbreak at the same time, with neither one canceling the other out. The man who stepped out of that lake in 1995 and became something bigger than himself has spent the 30 years since quietly trying to figure out who he actually is underneath the image everyone else built for him. At 65, that answer is still being written, and the work is clearly still underway. So what does it actually mean to have nearly everything the world calls success, and still carry that particular, quiet kind of ache underneath it? That is the question Colin Firth's life keeps circling back to, and it is exactly what makes his story worth sitting with. If you made it this far, thank you. This was not a light watch. If it gave you something to think about, consider leaving a like and subscribing so you catch the next one, because we cover stories exactly like this on a regular basis. Lives that look one way from the outside and feel completely different from within.